A very warm good evening, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 9 of Professor H.D. Sankalia monthly lecture series on Jain heritage. Today's lecture is titled as Guru, Goddess and God at Gyaraspur's Maladevi Jain temple, and our speaker is Mr. Anchit Jain. Uh, before we begin our lecture and before I ask the volunteer to kindly introduce the guest, I would like to give a basic introduction of Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair for Jain Archaeology and of this particular lecture series for the people who are joining in for the very first time. First of all, let me welcome you all on behalf of Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair for Jain Archaeology, Department of Ancient Indian History, Culture and Archaeology, Deccan College Postgraduate and Research Institute, deemed to be University Pune. Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair for Jain Archaeology was established at the Department of AIHC and Archaeology, Deccan College, at the financial support of International School for Jain Studies, a division of Amar Prerna Trust, and Vardhaman Charitable Foundation, USA. This was done with a view that studies in Jainism were mostly concentrated upon literature, philosophy, yoga, and similar things. But there should be a chair which deals with this particular aspects of art, architecture, archaeology, and heritage. With this view, the Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair for Jain Archaeology has worked on multiple aspects. We run a certificate course in Jain Art and Archaeology. We had organized the first National Annual Research Conference on Jain Heritage, and now the second conference is also on its way. We also organize intercollegiate quiz competition, this monthly lecture series. We also have an annual lecture in the name of Professor S.B. Dave and another lecture in the name of Professor M.A. Dhaki sir. We have an internship program where we train students in the field of Jain art and archaeology. And we are also working on a bibliography project specifically dedicated to the fields of Jain art, architecture, and archaeology. About this particular lecture series, why it has been named after Professor H.D. Sankalia sir, who was the forerunner of archaeology in India and who established the Department of AIHC in Archaeology at Deccan College. Professor H.D. Sankalia sir was amongst the foremost person who uh, played a seminal role in ascribing the Jain caves at Pale to the Jain application. The reading of the inscription was done by him along with Dr. Shobna Gokhale ma'am. In that times, it was not very much established in the archaeological world in the academia that Jainism prevailed in the region of Western Deccan as early as the 2nd century BCE. With this establishment of the fact that Jainism existed in the ancient period in the Western Deccan in 2nd century BCE, 1st century BCE by his articles, it was established, and that has led us to further avenues in the field of Jain studies, specifically in the region of Western Deccan. Apart from that, his various contributions to the field of archaeology has led us name this particular lecture series after this forerunner of archaeology, and that's why this series is now named as Professor H.T. Sankalia monthly lecture series on Jain heritage. Now, without any further delay, I would like to invite Dhananjay Khandari, research assistant of Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair for Jain Archaeology, to introduce our today's guest speaker, Anchit Jain.
Good evening, everyone. Our today's speaker, Anchit Jain, is a guest assistant professor of history at the Delhi College of Arts and Commerce, University of Delhi. His ongoing doctoral research deals with the history of the Caityavasin Jain monastic tradition of early medieval Western India and is working on the history of Jain monastic dwelling practice. He also works on Jain art with a focus on monastic representation. He has worked with the Geo Research Institute for the Temples of Indian project. He has presented his research at multiple international forums, such as the American Academy of Religion, Annual Jaina Studies Workshop, SOAS, University of London, European Association of South Asian Archaeology, Leipzig, Germany, Young Researchers Workshop, Strasbourg, France, World Sanskrit Conference, Nepal, and others. He is a recipient of UGC Junior Research Fellowship. On behalf of Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair, I welcome you, Anchit.
Thank you, Dhananjay Bhaiya. I now request our speaker, Mr. Anchit Jain, to kindly begin his lecture.
Jai Jirendra, Namaskar, good evening. Thank you so much to whole team member of Bhagwan Sheetalnath Jain Chair, Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair of Jain Archaeology, Deccan College, Pune, for your very kind invitation, Dhananjay, for your introduction, Gandhi sir, Ocean, and other team members, and everybody who have joined. It's always a pleasure to come back to Deccan College to participate in the events and all those fantastic activities that they are doing in promoting study of Jain art, archaeology, and architecture. So, without further ado, I'll share my presentation. Um, okay, so let's do the full screen. My audio is not very clear. Is it the case?
A little like it's clear, but there's some kind of a disturbance. Not disturbance actually, but like there is some
I think
minor
this is fine.
frequency
Let
kind of
me.
a thing that's coming.
Is it better?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, the topic of my presentation is Guru, Goddess, and God at Gyaraspur's Maladevi Jain Temple. So, why I named the title, so I'll come to that later. The Maladevi Jain Temple is like it's a phenomenally beautiful, very intricate Jain temple of 9th century that has been erected at the top of a hill at a place called Gyaraspur, now a small village, but that was once a very flourishing town in the district of Vidisha in central India. Now it's made at a very prominent location just above the hill. I mean, you get just a view of a picturesque valley, very, very beautiful. And the temple is at a very prominent place that even if you're seeing from right angle, you can view it from a very a very far distance. So we are trying to decode the history and the layers of meaning of this particular temple. Now, why I named the lecture as Guru, Goddess, and God at Gyaraspur's Mala Devi temple. Now, one reason being is that I wish to emphasize upon the multivalence of a temple, different layers of its meaning, different layers of history that can be unearthed when we look at this temple. Now, when I say a Jain temple, Mala Devi Jain temple, you know the immediate picture, the immediate understanding would be okay, it's a Jain temple dedicated to worship of Jinnah, Jain Tirthankar, and so on. But then temple can have so many more layers of meaning and its history. Say the temple could be reflective, and it becomes very evident in this case of Maladevi temple. Say about the monastic presence, the monastic developments of the time, the monastic polemics that you see within the monastic circles, right? Then this particular temple reveals a good deal of information about the goddess skulls, the purpose of making so many goddess images, the presence of goddess in this quote unquote shrine of Jinnah, right? And as I'll be arguing in the course of my presentation, that the the representations of goddesses is not just simply say a kind of a simple artistic motive, but very much deeply rooted to the identity of this temple. And hence comes the question of identities, right? Jain temple, it's fine, but then the temple has so many layers of its identities, which has to be situated within the broader, complex and political, complex religious and political landscape of Gyaraspur, which has so many temples, and how in this very complex religious landscape the temple could gain patronage. So these will be the kind of broader issues that I want to raise in my presentation. Now, as I said, that the Maladevi temple, which is a 9th century temple at Gyaraspur, it was one of the many temples that were erected during the early medieval period, roughly from 8th to 12th century, at the site of Gyaraspur. Now, the Jain presence in this broader region of Vidisha is quite old, and we do have certain, I mean, it must be before 4th century, certainly, but then we have a 4th century Jinnah image from Vidisha, and within the region of Gyaraspur, that is very close by, you have a 600 circa 600 CE image of Jinnah. So certainly, like a few centuries before the erection of the famous Maladevi temple. Now, at this particular site, we do have remains or records of some Buddhist stupas, of Shaiva, Shakti, and Vaishnava religious structures, which are roughly contemporary to the Maladevi temple, which were erected roughly from 8th to 10th century, right? Now, apart from them, we have some not remains, but records of a few prominent Shaiva shrines. The Krishneshwar temple that we know from a pilgrim record of 982 CE. Another temple, the Chamunda Swami Deva temple, which must have come to existence certainly before mid 9th century, received endowments from late 9th century, then again a major royal endowment in 12th century. So it's a, the Jains are sharing this landscape with different cults, different groups which are patronizing these temples. Now, we also have a number of Vaishnav shrines that sprouted after the 10th century. I hope the chronology should become very clear, because we'll be coming back to the issue of chronology again and again. The Maladevi temple is 9th century, right? The Jain presence is even older at the site, at least 600 CE or before, but then we have number of other shrines. Now, after 10th century, we see mushrooming of number of Vaishnav shrines as well, and I'll come to these. What were the broader, the political, say the political layers which influence construction of such temples, or the patronage of these temples, right? How the dynastic changes influence the process of temple patronage. So we again have a Vaishnav presence of Vaishnav temple construction activity from 10th century onwards up to 12th century, right? So we have an Hindola Toran. Okay, this is Bajramath Mutt, a Vaishnav shrine roughly erected from 10th to 12th, sometime somewhere between 10th to 12th century. Hindola Toran, a 12th century, that is the surviving element of a prominent 12th century Vaishnav temple. Then we also have this very fascinating image of Sadashiva, Sadashivan from at the State Museum, Bhopal. So what we're talking about is, like as I said, a complex landscape where we have shrines dedicated to various gods and goddesses. This, excuse me. Think the fan is creating some disturbance, so I just switched off the fan. But it's difficult to be without fan in the hot weather of Delhi. But just I hope the audio is not disturbed. Okay, so what I was emphasizing was about this very complex religious landscape of Gyaraspur, in which we have to situate the Mala Devi temple. Now, this is an east facing temple with, with very interesting temple architecture. It consists of, I mean, you can easily see one opening porch. At the front, you have a toran, no, sorry, not toran, the gateway, an opening porch. Then you have the mandap, the Gura mandap. Now you have a sanctum, the Mula Prasada, the sanctum and mandap are connected via antaral, a vestibule, something typical of any temple of this time. Now, what makes it very fascinating is some other unique architectural elements, and I have two reasons why my interest developed on this particular temple site. Now, when we think about this Mala Devi temple, there is a very unique element. Now, you look at this image. Now, we are looking at the back of the temple. Now, you see there is a kind of the rock ledge, right? The temple is built next to the hill. Now, there is a evident destruction. I mean, the temple is now in a very pitiable state, right? But it's not that there was an earthquake and the rocks suddenly fall on that. Now, there is a mystery of a secret space within the temple, right? Now, a very unique feature of this temple is that the main shrine was uniquely crafted against the ridge of a hill by including the rock ledge in the ceiling of the sanctum. So what you have was originally a hollow space, a kind of a natural cell or a kind of a natural cave that was on the hill. Now, it must have carried some sacred importance before the construction of the temple. So that particular cell was not disturbed, but rather was included or incorporated within the structural shrine that was built over there. So as Michael Meester, has highlighted the significance of this modulation in his description of the temple as that has been carefully fitted to an existing rock, its walls nestled against a natural crevice so that the particular spot could form the sanctum, the roof of sanctum being the rock which sheltered natural cell. And further, he says, such a situation can only be explained by supposing that this spot to have had a great sanctity, either through some magical association or through its use by a particular revered saint. If so, that saint has been well honored. Unquote. So this is very interesting situation where you already had a place which had some kind of sacrality, and I would rather be interested in unearthing that mystery of that kind of a sacred space, some possible reasons why, what could have been the original association of that, that sacred spot, and why it was incorporated into the temple. So that was the one thing which really fascinated me about this temple, and I would like to discuss this in much more details later on. Another thing which really fascinated me about this temple, and actually pushed me to to dwell further and research upon this temple, was its doorway, its toran. Right now, at the first view, that it may not look something very different. You have a standard shakhas, you have river goddesses Ganga, Yamuna, you have Dwarpal, you have other assisting figures. You have a Nagraj. I hope you can see my cursor moving, right. So some of the very figures which you can really expect in a typical temple of this time. Now, what you have something very different is, if you can see, there is a lotus that is sprouting, from this base. Now, at the lotus, you have some figures which are carved. Now, surrounding this lotus are again heavenly figures. You have, Vidyadhara, the holding garlands. You have Gandharva playing musical instrument, and so on. All whole attalier of these figures. Now, similar kind of figures you can see on both sides, right? Now, these are the zoomed images. This one is on the left, this one is on the right. So again, you have a lotus, then at the center you have a male figure, right? Now, who is worshipped, adored by probably his disciples on this side, and then surrounded by these garland bearers and the all flying celestial beings. Now, on the right side, again, you have another figure on a very high cushion. Now, he's worshipped by some, and there is some other activity going on. Again, they are surrounded by musicians and all those heavenly beings. Now, who are these figures, and why were they carved at such a prominent location? Once you enter, as you enter the temple, these will be the first thing which you can notice. Surprisingly, I mean, not so surprisingly, it was noticed by several scholars, but their identification remained quite problematic. Now, Krishna Deva has written a very interesting monologue on, I mean, a very short but very fascinating monologue on the Maladevi temple. Now, Krishna Deva identified the central figure, if you can see, central figure on the left and right hand side as a god. I mean, which god is he? Mahavir? Is it? I mean, no, whoever, and a sage on the other side. Now you have other set of scholars, for example, Adi Trivedi. Now he identified the central figure as Lakulish. Now, for those who are not, I mean, who are lacking a background in archaeology or art history or religious history, Lakulish is considered as an incarnation of Shiva, often shown epiphalic. Now, these figures are also naked, as clearly visible. So, R.D. Trivedi was of opinion that the central figure is of Lakulish, the incarnation of Shiva, and then because he's surrounded by four figures on the both on both lotuses, so he identified them with four of his disciples, Kushikamitra, Garga, Kaurashya. Now, this identification becomes problematic on many grounds. I mean, why was Lakulish placed on a Jain temple? If he was a Lakulish, why you have this scene of someone moving away from the central figure, if that is Lakulish, and why is his disciple moving away? And usually, Lakulish has a has I mean, you look at the whole iconography, nowhere it suits with the narrative of Lakulish, but then his interpretation was had such a strong impact. Now he identified, rather misidentified, that the temple was perhaps originally related to Shiva or Shakti, and that is why you had image of Lakulish, and later it was converted to a Jain temple. Now this was interpretation of R.D. Trivedi. Now the proposition was continued by some successive scholars, Richard Solomon, George Michel, and others, following the model that the temple was originally Hindu in dedication and later converted into Jain fold. Now, these interpretations were questioned by Krishna Deva. I'm just briefly doing the broader historiography. Now, who very efficiently has here proven that the temple from its inception was a Jain temple. And if you see one or two Brahmanical, quote unquote, Brahmanical images, they do not warrant above proposition. So it's clear that the temple was originally a Jain from its inception. Krishna Deva did not go into identifying these figures. Now I'm 100% sure, because I've been working on the visual representation of Jain monks and sometimes nuns on the Jain structural temples in the central and western India, and it is very well evident that the figures that you are seeing on these lotuses are actually Jain monks. So at the center you have a Digambar Jain Acharya. The temple belongs to the Digambar school. He is in the Vyakhyan Mudra, the pose of teaching, and this is something that you always see in the iconographical representation of a teacher, Jain Acharya, now never with a Jaina. Right now, he is surrounded by the monks. Diminish his size. The one on his right, this must be an Upadhyay, the next in hierarchy, having a book on his hands. Then you have, two disciples on this side, who are simple monks. They are holding the broom or pichika. And then you have this very interesting man who is holding his hand above. His one hand is upraised. Now, this is a posture that you see in number of miniature paintings of Western India, where both laity and monks are this kind of convention, this kind of posture of hand being upraised is an iconographical convention to represent the listeners of the discourse. So you have an acharya, then you have either lay or the monastic listeners. So this becomes mudra of listeners in number of miniature paintings as well. Okay. Now on the other side, you again have a lotus. Then on the lotus, there is a very prominent cushion, and I haven't seen any other figure in Central India or Western India where monk has been placed on such a high cushion. He's placed on this cushion again, surrounded by celestial beings. Then you have a Jain disciple, who are just bowing in front of him, establishing his hierarchy. And then you have this very strange figure whom I identify as a kind of a Brahmanical ascetic. You can see the kopin is very well visible. His jatas are visible. Right now, it's a very interesting scene that he is just moving away from the image of the monk at the center, Acharya at the center, as in where he's leaving the scene in anguish, or perhaps supposedly sidelined, being brushed away, or somewhere he's being ousted, or either he's moving in anger, or someone is trying to pacify him. So again, this becomes a very bold. We have two very bold statements just at the entrance of the temple, and this is something you notice them immediately once you enter. So they are being carved on a very prominent location. Right, these are very strong and very bold visual statements with a strong polemical and perhaps a commemorative intent. Now, if we are trying to look at the parallels of such a representation, where you have these, monks represented on the lotus on the other side of the gateway. Now, we do have few temples, say at the Telika Mandir, which is roughly contemporary to the Maladevi temple. You have representation of Lakulish. At the Markhera Sun temple, you have representation of Surya. So, I mean, the motive is something pan-regional. But then on these temples, you have depiction of a deity, right? So one would expect that maybe Jaina or some goddess Yakshini was represented at this very prominent location. But rather, what you see is representation of monks, right? I mean, it can open several questions. Now, within the Jain context, if I want to draw a parallel, we do have representation of Jain monks on this prominent location above the lotus in a few temples after 11th century. So, say for example, at Deogarh we have a number of temples where you have similarly a lotus where Jain acharyas are depicted. Now, these are temples are of 11th, 12th century. We do have some other Jain temples, say one near Sagar, in the in one of the museums of Sagar, and a few sites where you have this representation, but that actually became popular after 11th, 12th century. So the one that we are seeing at Maladevi temple is certainly quite older, a kind of a precursor to them. But what is further more fascinating is that the kind of bold treatment of the subject that you see, I mean, this is really amazing. The kind of very bold treatment that you are seeing is something that you don't encounter other place, where these monks are surrounded by all these celestial beings, a kind of hierarchy that is being created, the kind of narrative that there is a Jain monk at the center and then a Hindu is setting, he who's being ousted away. This is something that you don't, I mean, I've been working on this thing for several months and I haven't found any similar example. I mean, there is one. I mean, at the Mount Abu temple, Dilwara. Sorry, I don't have image. You do have figure of a Hindu ascetic bowing down in front of a Jain acharya, and there is this very few examples, but that is at the ceiling. So what does that reflect? I mean, what are these bolder statements trying to convey at the Maladevi temple? Is it kind of an aspired Jain domination at the site? A kind of a reflective, the kind of patronage which the temple got, and the kind of the magnanimous structure that was built at this site. Or could this be a representation of a historical monk? I mean, it could be an idealized representation of a generic monk, perhaps having a polemical intent of showing Jain monk in a very ideal way as a kind of an expert debater. Or could this be a representation of a historical monk who was perhaps associated at that sacred hollow space on the ledge? So, if you remember, I mentioned, the temple is very strategically crafted to include the originally the already existing sacred cave into the temple where it became the sanctum of the temple. So was it this? Were they commemorating a historic monk who was associated with the secret ledge, or with the secret ledge? So we can have number of speculations, we can have number of possibilities. Now, when I try to look at this particular kind of image, and what we see is that this reflects a broader norm in the monastic develop and a broader trend that you see in the Jain monasticism in early medieval Western India, early medieval Central India, in Deccan, where monks are glorified increasingly as an expert debater. Now, this is something you find in the monastic eulogies in number of texts. You see them in inscriptions, and something which got percolated in the visual portrayal of monks, because we have to also take care that in number of these inscriptions the monks have a prefix vadi means debater. Some of the famous Shwetambar monks, their name is Vadi Devasuri, Vadi Vedala Shanti Suri, and so on. Even one 11th century Digambar epistemologist Prabhachandra from central India. Now he calls him. He was glorified in an inscription as Pandit Shri Prabhachandra Rudravadi Gajankusha. Who is as expert debater, like who's like a very fierce debater. He's referred to as Pandit. He's referred to as as a great debater. Who's like controls elephants and so on. So this is uh, kind of a broader language in which the monks are eulogized and glorified in the texts and inscriptions. And what we are seeing is a very interesting parallel between these textual depictions and the way the monks have been idealized in a very hierarchical position, where they are dealing with their, with the religious rival, or and so on, right? So I'll come more over this, and we get further information on this issue from a very important inscription. It's called the British Museum stone inscription of Tripuri Kalachuri Prince Villeka. Now, this inscription, I mean, it's also ninth century, mid to late ninth century. It's contemporary to the Gyaraspur, to the Maladevi temple, and it's written in such a beautiful script. Now, the temple, this particular stone inscription was first reported in 1830, and as originating from Gyaraspur. Now we don't know, I don't know where was it originated from Gyaraspur, but what we know is that it records construction of a Jain temple by the Kalachuri prince named Velleka, who was feudatory of the Gurjar Pratihari king Bhojadeva. Even though its exact find spot was unrecorded, but considering the Grand Maladevi temple to be the only known Jain remain at the site, and their common approximate dating, that is late 9th century, Solomon suggested, and I agree, that it was quite likely referring to none other than the Maladevi temple itself. Now, if this identification is correct, it shares great deal of information about the history of this temple. Now, the Prince Vellaka, the feudatory chief Vellaka, seems to have had a close association with the local Jain community of Gyaraspur, considering the lengthy eulogy of him that we find in the inscription and of his family that was composed by none other than a Digambar monk, Devasena of the Nandi Sangh. Right, so you have this very interesting scene from Gyaraspur, 9th century, where the local chief is having a very strong relationship with this Digambar Jain monk, Devasena of the Nandi Sangha. Now, at the end of the inscription, the Devasena is being eulogized as a very prominent ascetic, and I read, this is translation of Solomon. The foremost of those who know on it verse, and this is how Devasena is described, a formidable debater, Vadi, whose clever mind has been sharpened by practice in various philosophies, who shines like beautiful gold, whose way of life is righteous, who has seen the far shore of the ocean of the doctrine of the unclothed ones, Vivasana, a master ascetic, well renowned. He composed this eulogy with proper meters and with entire clear expression. Right. So you again see a kind of a parallel in the way the monk Devasena is being described, as a formidable debater whose clever mind has been sharpened by the practice in various philosophies. So a close parallel between the textual description and the visuality of this temple. So you have this very rare representation of the textual ideals of a monk as a debater. It itself reflects a lot on the nature of monastic developments of this time. Now, irrespective of the fact whether, I mean, I'm of this opinion that the Maladevi temple, because of this particular comparison and many other reasons, that the Maladevi temple and the one recorded in the Villaks epigraph or the British Museum inscription, they are referring to the same temple. But even if there is even if in the case of other possibility, it becomes so apparent that this monk Acharya Devasena had played an important role in securing the patronage for the construction of this temple, or whatever Jain temple at the site of Gyaraspur, of which we have no other record, and a number of financial endowments in this very complex landscape of Gyaraspur, with competitive patronage and number of cults and practices and presence of Shakti, Shaiva, Vaishnava, Buddhist, and so on. And then ultimately erecting the most towering landmark of the town at this very prominent towering location. So like he's some, I mean, he has to be credited for augmenting this kind of cementing this kind of relation with the local chief. And one can simply speculate how this monk Devasena, right, he was related to the sacred, to whosoever sacred being that was associated with that hollow space on the hill, which was turned into the sanctum of the temple, right? I mean, we can just speculate. I mean, there was certainly that from the archaeological records, we know there was a kind of a sacred cave or crevice that was, because of its sacrality, that was strategically included in the temple, right? And how is Devasena or these monks represented at this, in either in the inscription or visually, how they're related to that particular spot? Could this be a spot where some prominent monk, Devasena, or the guru of Devasena, perform some austerities? I mean, this is just a matter of speculation. The inscription does not reveal much information about that. But there are many other dimensions which we should also discuss to unearth layers of the meanings of this, the meaning of the temple, and then try to understand the correlation between these monks, between this inscription, between the political system and patronage of the site, this unique temple architecture. And for understanding this thing, we have to temporarily shift from discussion on monks to discussion over the goddesses of the site. And as I labeled the talk, Guru, God, and Goddess at the Maladevi Temple of Gyaraspur. Now, this is again a very fascinating image from the British Museum, London, of a Jain goddess. She's eight-armed, holding chakra, shankha, is this a garland, perhaps a book, and so on. A discus, eight-armed goddess, beautiful goddess, surrounded by the atelier of these garland bearers, chori bearers, and other attendant figures. At the top is a figure of Jinnah. Right now, her name is inscribed, and you can read Sulochana. Right. So she is Sulochana. She is Yakshi. I think it's Yakshi of Mallinath, if I'm not wrong. So she's Yakshi of Tirthankar Padma Prabhu. So we have this very interesting inscribed image from Gyaraspur. And what we learn that many such beautiful images of goddesses once adorned the Mala Devi temple of Gyaraspur. And our discussion comes to this point that what purpose do they serve? What purpose do they solve? Right. Now the temple exterior, if we, I mean, let me again show images of the temple. Okay. Now, if you see, there are number of empty niches. Some are the bigger niches. Some are the smaller ones. Like here, these are the bigger niches. Then you have number of niches in the recess. There are some surviving goddess figures. There are some niches over here. So all of them were once filled with images of goddesses and perhaps also of Juno. There's a reason why I emphasize more on goddesses. Okay, let's come back to Solochana. And as I said, this temple exterior had number of niches where you had several goddess figures. And I raise a question: were these simply space fillers that you have, your own pantheon of Jain goddesses, and you have empty niches, so you are just fixing images of goddesses on the niches, or do they solve some other purpose? That is the kind of question that I raise, and I'll dwell further into that. So many of these images, thanks the we are fortunate that some of these goddesses are inscribed. So we here name Vahini Shikha, Tarapati, Hima, etc., which appear to be the regional variants of goddesses. We hear some similar sounding names from Deoghar and other sites as well. But at the same time, there are a number of goddesses which are so difficult to identify, or the iconography is completely different. Say, for example, if you look at this particular goddess, I think I may have a bigger image of her as well. This eight-armed goddess on this particular niche. Now she sits on a strange vahan of a bird with two heads. And to the best of my understanding, I don't know if any such vahan for a goddess in the popular text on iconography. If somebody can identify, I'll be very grateful. But a very interesting figure of this goddess holding a bow. Right. Okay. Yeah. this bird with two heads, and then she's having a bow and other things. Now we also have many similar goddesses which are difficult to identify. Now here you have this image of a four-armed goddess. Right now she is having a kind of an umbrella in one of her arm. Now this is some then on this side it has been identified like an as a net-like object by Krishna Deva. Then you have a vajra, then you have a kind of a standard a staff on which a human being is surmounted. Now, Krishna Deva called it as consort of Revanta. Revanta is son of Surya, right? So, as a consort of Revanta, I would seriously doubt that on what basis. I mean, this lacks any context or any kind of corroboration. um, I raise question that could this be perhaps a local iconographic or perhaps a cultic reorientation, perhaps a more tantric one of the Jain Vidya Devi Achyuta. Now, Achyuta, this is from Ocean 8th century. Achyuta is often shown with her horse. Here you have horse as her Vahan. Could this be Achyuta? And from other records of 12th century, we know that Achyuta, the Vidya Devi Achyuta, developed some local cultic importance for some Jain communities of central India, where from a 12th century inscription we learn that Achyuta became the Gotra Devi of certain Jains in central India. So could this be a kind of a local experimental reorientation? Perhaps she has some tantric element to it. This is something difficult to comment with certainty. But what we see is that some of the Vidya Devis were actually developing their independent cults. We also have a number of figures of standing goddesses with serpent heads on the niches. She's there were some they are to the list of more obscure goddesses on the temple. Now, it further strengthens the view that perhaps the larger empty niches also house the images of goddesses, like the one of Sulochana from British Museum. So, at the on the temple exterior, they were and they were they once had number of beautiful images of Jain goddesses. Okay, some more. Right now, we don't. When we think about Jain goddesses, and the students of Jain history would be aware that the most important Jain goddess is Ambika. Right now, she is Yakshini of Neminat, but prior to 10th century, and then even after, she had her own independent identity. Now we have some impressive images of Ambika from various sites of central India. Now the first image is from Dhar, 11th century, from the British Museum. Then the central image is of again Ambika, who is always who is usually associated with a mango tree and children, and image from a place near Shivpuri at the Bhopal State Museum. Then on the right is a very impressive image, roughly 5 feet tall, from the Hinglajgarh in Indore Museum. And I mean, if you this image is placed just next to another image of Jinnah from Hinglajgarh, and the size of the image of goddess Ambika and of the Jinnah are same. Like roughly, they are both huge figures of 5 feet, over 5 feet tall. So certainly we had number of independent shrines as well of Ambika, and if they were part of the Jain temple, they were placed on a very prominent location. So the cult of Ambika was very strong, and that we know from various sites in central India. Some of them have just huge images of Ambika. Now, even though we don't have any surviving image, I mean, there are images of Ambika on the minor dishes, but there is a quite strong possibility that there were prominent positioning of Ambika images inside the temple. In 1871, Begler had reported a small image of goddess inside the temple, inside the Maladevi temple, shown under a tree, and he problematically identified the goddess with Maya Devi, now which he hailed as the most remarkable of the numerous statues lying inside the temple, as well as very and something that is very well executed. Now this image is completely lost, but this exquisite image appears to be likely that of the Ambika, right? He describes this goddess image under the tree, and it's quite likely it was of Ambika, who's often shown seated under the mango tree, and may have been a cultic image inside the temple. Now, it is quite likely that an independent image of goddess, likely Ambika or Amba, was worshipped inside the Maladevi temple. When I think about the placing of the image that was reported by Begler, her image might have been placed in one of the niches on the inner wall of the mandap. So inside the temple, inside the mandap, on the niches of the wall, most likely the western wall, and I can come to the reason why on the western wall, formed by purely decorative blind windows on the otherwise bare wall. So it was on that niche that was created by these blind windows where where the image of Amba, which Begler reported, might have been possibly placed. Now we have number of other goddess images inside the temple. Like one can expect the positioning of Jina Tirthankar at the most paramount position inside the temple, but some of the surrounding sacred spaces were also housed by goddess. Now there are empty niches on the antaral, the vestibule. Then there are empty niches on the three sides of the inner on the three sides of the wall of the it's an open. There is an open ambulatory, right? So on the three walls of the inner sanctum, we have niches where you have three niches on all three sides, and in one of the niches is still surviving image of goddess Chakreshwari, right? Yakshini of the first Tirthankar. So what we have this a site with number of goddess images, some very prominent images of goddesses, some very different set of images that were placed on the prominent locations inside and outside the temple. Now, to further understand the placement of goddesses, and then to my question, that is it simply that Jains had they developed their own cult of goddesses, and some of them identified as the Gotra Devi, or some of them developed independent cult? Could this be the reason for such a prominent representation of goddesses? Because this is something representation of goddesses also known from other sites as well. But if we again read the Velak inscription, right, the British Museum stone inscription of the Kalachuri Prince of Velak, right? Now the inscription starts with invocation of Jina, followed by praise to Chakreshwari. Now, as I said, Chakreshwari is the first, is Yakshini of the first Tirthankar. She was from an archaeological perspective, one can say she was the most she was the second most popular Jain goddess in central India. She occupies key position on the temple lintels. This you can see at the Maladevi temple. This you can see at the temple of Budi Chanderi. You can see at Khajuraho and number of other sites. So the inscription starts with invocation to Chakreshwari. Now this is followed by praise to Amba. Now the word used is not Ambika but Amba. Now Amba is referred several times in the inscription. Now, this is followed by eulogy of the king Bhoja and his chief Belaka. Now, interestingly, Amba in this inscription, she is treated as a Jain goddess, but she is referred to as the supreme goddess Parmeshanandam Shakti, right? And as you see, the tones in which the Amba is being described is a lot of, can say, develop a parallel with the representation of Shakti in a Shakta tradition or Sri Vidya. Now, the reason that the inscription makes very clear why this Jain temple was built at Gyaraspur, right, and why Devasena was invested and so on, right. The reason for making temple is that the glorious Amba appeared before King Raja, and the ruler, the king, the famous King Bhoj Pratihar ruler, was so fascinated, was so spellbound that the glorious Amba has manifested in front of him, and that is the reason for making temple. Okay. Now, how is temple described? Right. The temple is described as Sri Vimanam, Jainam Sri Bhavanam, Jinap Bhavanam Sri Sanatham. Now here is the twist. Now it is very common that even today we use the word Sri Mahavir Ji, Sri Oshya Siddha Kshetra. Shri Girnachita. So Shri in this kind of a honorific way we use very commonly, right? Even today. But the way it is described here is a bit different, right? It is Shri Vimanam, Jainam Shri Bhavanam, right? It should be Shri Jainam Bhavam, grammatical thing. It's Jainam Shri Bhavanam, the Bhavan that is related with Shri. Jinapa Bhavan Shri Sanatham, a Bhavan of Jina along with that is affiliated, that is related with Shri or goddess. So the temple is all is in every time temple is described in relation with goddess, in relation with Shri. Now the ultimate things come from the last portion of the inscription, which records the donation to the temple, where we are learning about the grant of a village to goddess Amba, and not Jina, right? But the grant of the village to goddess Amba, right? Along with Jina, along with donations to Jina, or being, or the portion is not very clear, but perhaps a construction of a Jain residence or some abode associated with the Nandi Sangha of the Digambar tradition, right? So what we are here, I mean, the whole positioning of, and this of so many goddess images, and if you try to draw parallel with the way I mean the temple is described, I mean someone can I mean even if the temple described in the Vellak inscription is different from the Maladevi temple, though we don't have any other remains at Gyaraspur. But then it itself, reveals a strong cult associated with Jain goddess Amba, Ambika, who is then conflated with Shakti Amba, and right. And because of this association, the temple is getting patronage. Now, inside the temple, one unexpectedly finds a frieze of Brahmanical Saptamatrika, seven mothers, along with Ganesh and Veerabhadra. Right now, and for me, this again adds to the way the the makers of the temple, the sthapati, the acharya, the monks, those who were patronizing the temple, they were drawing parallel between the Hindu Shakti cult and the Jain cult of Ambika. Now, in the inscription, she is described with strong tones as "Te nai tajate ne syape villaka, Jain marge chaturtar dhiya कारितम श्री विमानम पापर्दि प्रत्यनीकम kamalvanam eva Sri Nivasamanam. Now the kamalvanam, I mean the symbology of kamalvanam, it's very much related to the placement of Sri Chakra, the Sri Nivasamanam. I mean there is a very strong tone of Shakti. Now, does this placement, right, reflect an attempt to equate the Jain goddess, and I mean the placement of this Brahmanical Saptamatrika or the conflation of Amba Ambika? Does this placement reflect an attempt to equate Jain goddess Ambika with the Brahmanical primordial Shakti, and an intentional conflation of Jain Ambika with the Brahmanical goddess Amba that is also referred in the record? Is it possible that Maladevi temple was perhaps once was famous for the cult of Jain goddess, particularly Amba and Ambika, which perhaps resulted into a popular memory of the name of the temple? Right now, when Cunningham visited the site of Gyaraspur in 1880, the temple was locally known as Maladevi. Right, Bhandarka, when Bhandarka visited, he called it Malada. Right. Now, when Krishna Deva in 1969 was writing account of the temple, he Sanskritized it to Mala Devi. Now, it is not fully clear that if this the contemporary vernacular usage Malada, Malade was corruption of the original Devi, Mala Devi. But I mean, one can raise a speculation that could this be a result of this Shakti, the goddess association temple, perhaps resulted in the popular memory of the name of this temple. Now, at least in South India, in Karnataka, we have some very prominent Jain shrines which are associated with Jain goddesses. Say at the Simhangade, it has a group of temples, but everyone who visits the temple, it's mainly for the shrine of Jwalamalini, right? We have similar shrines for Padmavati and so on. So, I mean, is it possible that the temple, the Gyaraspur, the Maladevi temple of Gyaraspur, was a strong cult center of the Jain goddess Ambika, right? Which understands, which which then which one then we can relate with the Vellak inscription and the popularity of various goddess images on the shrine, the overwhelming popularity of the goddess images. Or it could be, I mean, quite likely it could be an image. It could be, the Garbhagriha, you could have image of a Tirthankar, but then very important cultic image of Ambika and other goddesses on the niches of the mandap and other places in the temple. One can also speculate if the um, oh, I think there is some. Just give me a second to reconnect. Just a second. Yeah. I'm sorry for this disturbance. And let's take this time to, I mean, you are now aware of the broader currents, and we are at the last leg of our discussion. And try to relate the developments, the historical evidence, the archaeological, the epigraphical records, whatever we have discussed, try to relate them with the sacred crevice, the hollow spot that we encountered at the beginning of the lecture, and which resulted in building this particular temple at this very prominent location on the hill. Okay, let me share again. Uh, okay. Mm, Vivi. Okay. Now, could this kind of conflation between Ambika, the architectural representation, the textual portrayals, so on, what would have been the impact of this on patronage? Now, it appears that the local Jain monks seem to have played a major role in popularizing the goddess cult. Now, this is something we know from other sites also. This is not something very strange, but irrespective of the whether the connection, irrespective of the connection between the Velak inscription and the Maladevi temple, even if they are talking about the same temple, which I agree, or some other temple, it is very clear that the monk Devendra Sen, the Jain monk Devendra Sen of Nandi Sangh at the site of Gyaraspur, he succeeded in securing a major financial endowment, patronage, and support of the non-Jain Prince Vellaka, for whom he wrote the Prashasti as well, and the King Bhoja, who were perhaps devotees of Shakti, Amba, and then persuading them to build the temple of Jinnah. So even if they are not talking about, I mean, the Maladevi temple, they are certainly talking about very prominent temple that is associated with Jain goddess Ambika at Gyaraspur. Now, one of the strategic employed in the process was equating the Jain goddess with the Brahmanical Shakti by including panels of seven mother goddesses, Saptamatrika, and I mean, I'm just diverting for a second, but as you proceed further in the succeeding centuries, 12th century, 13th century, these kind of incorporations become much more prominent. Even in the pratishtha rituals, I mean, in the Sri Vidya, there is Sola Nitya. The Jain pratishtha ritual would have Sola Vidya Devi. Sometimes they even include Devi Bhagavati. And there is a strong incorporation of the Shakti tradition in the Jordan. This is something which has to be explored, and scholars should move into, should start working in the direction of goddess cult. Was certainly the impact of Sri Vidya in general was a lot on the Jain tradition. Okay, now having discussed everything, one can speculate, and if you just think about this, that hollow on the rock ledge above the hill, which became the spiritual nucleus of the temple, so one can think, was it originally associated to a venerable monk, who performed the austerities at the site. Right, so someone would have performed maybe Sallekshana or some tap dhyan over that sacred space, and later on a temple was built at the site, perhaps by his disciple. Could he be Devendra Sen or whosoever? We don't know. I mean, could he be the monk who was represented just at the at the facade of the temple, just next to the doorway, where a prominent Jain Acharya was shown defeating a Brahmanical ascetic in some kind of a debate or a competitive setup? Is that Was that hollow ledge associated with that thing? Or it was associated with a monk who also promoted the goddess worship on the path of Jina. So as the inscription says, Jaina, something like Jaina Marge Chaturthara, something like this, right? So was it related to a monk who also promoted goddess worship? Or is it possible that that sacred spot was also the spot of a Jain god? It was identified and promoted as a sacred spot of a Jain goddess, and was promoted. Such thing was promoted by local monks, and later on temple was built at that particular site. Because I mean, just to think, draw parallels, we have so many hills on which you have some Shakti shrine, Shakti Peter, right? And then a structural temples built over that spot. And from a Jain perspective, like the site of Girnar associated with Ambika, Ocean, you have Satya Devi, and so on. So could it be possible that I mean, these are all speculations, that could it be a secret spot that was associated with Jain goddess on that hill, and later temple was built, and so on. So the mystery and the enigma of this temple continues, and it's very difficult to come with a firm answer. Right. But then what we are learning are the layers of meanings and narratives that get, interwoven with this kind of a temple. You're learning about the monastic presence, monastic polemics, monastic debates, the way the way monks are being represented and idealized, right? The close relation that these monks have to build with the ruling chief, writing their eulogies and so on. At the same time, how this, I mean, usually in our usually when we think about Maladevi, and it's always Maladevi Jain temple, and then we limit our discussion. Okay, there must have been image to Jinnah, certainly, but this temple was much more than a shrine dedicated to Jinnah. Now, coming to the last point of my presentation, that is the afterlife of the temple. Now, the temple was built in 9th century, thanks to some great patronage by Villak or some other people. I mean, depends on how you relate the Villak inscription and this temple. Now, even though the Jain presence at this site is attested at least till the 12th century, because we have records of pilgrims in 12th century visiting the temple, there is no structural or sculptural fragments or other kind of archaeological remains of the belonging to the Jain tradition after the 9th century. Right. So this thing, I mean, no significant I mean, no construction of Jain affiliation after the 9th century. So perhaps the peak of this Jain presence was at the time of Villaka. The success of monks in securing the royal patronage seems to be short-lived and declined after the fall of Pratihara. So again, making the chronology clear, 9th century, Villak was the local chief of a local Kalachuri branch, who was a feudatory of the Pratihara king of Bhoja. Now, after 10th century, right, we see from 10th century we see a dynastic change that there's a rise of Chandelas, and at this time onwards we see emergence of Vaishnav structures, right, parallelly with the rise of Chandelas, but who were also patronizing the Shaiva structures. Now we also see that the some of the local shrines, say for example the Chamunda Swami temple, right, or perhaps the whole complex that in which the temple was part of, was already in existence during the mid 9th century, because we know during the time Maladevi temple was built, or whatever Jain temple was built by Villaka, right, this temple was getting patronage of merchants in 9th century. Now, the temple survived in the succeeding period, and by the 12th century, it was heavily endowed by the local branch of Parmar. So, talking about the about after the 9th century, what we see is that even though the Jain presence is attested by inscriptions at least till the 12th century, the Jain construction activity seems to have declined after the construction of Maladevi temple. With the political shift, with the emergence of Chandelas and Paramas, we again see that the patronage is shifting completely to the Vaishnav shrines or the Shaiv shrines. There are blooming of Vaishnav shrines after the 10th century. Now, there is also there is also a reason to believe that perhaps that the earlier fantastic grant of endowments of villages that was under the financial benefits that were given to the Jain temple by the Villak was revoked by the later rulers. Now, for this, we have to again come back to the this inscription, this beautiful inscription. Now, just notice the script, right? It's so beautiful. Now, at the bottom of the script, if you look over here, the script has changed. So there is a postscript that was added roughly dateable to 11th century in an unidentified local vernacular. Solomon has pointed that this line probably refers to some subsequent alteration or controversy over donations recorded in the inscription, hinting towards the revoking. Right. So in this case, it alludes to shifting religious currents and political patronage after the dynastic change. And it's not difficult to imagine that the major grants that were given by the Pratihar chief was revoked by the later rulers. So Solomon is also of this opinion. So, but I mean, despite all these things, it seems likely that the Jain presence continued at the site despite centuries of ups and downs, even after the 12th century, and continued even to a very late period, perhaps to this date. Now, with this thing, I would like to end my discussion on the Mala Devi temple, and just my purpose was to emphasize upon its multivalency, different how it reveals so much information about the competitive patronage, about the monastic developments, about the goddess shrine, and different layers of meaning that gets unfolded. We try to touch upon the mystery, the unsolvable mystery of the sacred spot on which the temple was built, the broader message, the broader statement which the patrons of this temple wanted to convey by prominently showing monks on the either side of the doorway, in a very where the monks were idealized in a very highly honorific manner. So with this, I'll wrap my presentation. My special thanks to Dr. Shrikant Ganvir, Mr. and Ocean and his whole and their whole team for this invitation and support. My special thanks to Dr. Sushma Jansari and her team at the British Museum London for providing photographs of the Villak inscription. My gratefulness to Soumya Saxena for assisting me in the field work and taking me to the site, Rudra Srivastava for his help in the epigraphical works, Yash Jain, a local resident, for sharing images as requested. Special thanks to all the listeners. And lastly, a request, a kind of a awareness drive that the site is in the need of much better preservation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anchit, for showing us by example of how temple can be interpreted, how the varied layers of iconography, art history, and the religious socio-economic dynamics could be understood from this particular example of yours at Maladevi Temple. We are very happy
Thank you. Thank
that
you.
you were the person who delivered this particular lecture. We have some questions, and I will
Sure.
read the question one by
Sure.
one, and we request you to answer them. Rupesh Madkar is asking, if the site was earlier utilized by the monk for his austerities, can those sites be converted in the sanctum of the temple? Was that a common practice, or was it practiced somewhere else also?
Okay. Um, um, Thank you, Rupeshi, for your question. We have met last year. Rupeshi, to your question, Yeah, at least at this site, it becomes quite likely that I mean, it is not sure that what was the thing which derived sacrality to that spot. If it was indeed associated with a Jain monk, right, it was then converted into a structural temple in which the sacred spot was converted into the sanctum, right? Now, do we have parallels of this? Not to my knowledge. Right now, there are many sites where monks have performed sallekha, and on these spots, you lecture and paduka, or have nishidhis, or sometimes could be a small structure to commemorate the association. But I am not aware of any other example in which any site associated at least with the Sallekna. If with Sallekna, the monk has performed Sallekna, and that particular spot of Sallekna or the site of cremation was converted into a temple. Now, there can be another way of looking at it is that we do have example of sites which were once known for Sallekna, and later on with the passage of time they got converted into the shrines of into centers of devotion. I mean, the most prominent work is of S. Setar, inviting death, pursuing death on the Shavan Belgola, right, where he argues that the two sacred hills were the sites associated with Sallekna, with austerities, and later on these were converted into there was change in the overall I mean the overall the overall tone of this site, with emergence of huge image of Bahubali, with huge image of with number of temples. Now, in Deccan, I mean, in Tamil Nadu, we have some caves which which used to be residence of monks for Vaishnavas or for longer duration, difficult to say, where monks must have performed austerities, but later on temples were built at this site. Right. So there are two ways from looking at to your question. I hope this helps.
Yes, thank you very much, Anchit, for answering that question. Another question is by Amal Ranjan, and he's saying, can this temple be said to be highly influenced by the religious environment surrounding it, in the sense that we do find multiple images of Matrukas and Yoginis in the nearby Gadarmal Devi temple, which Vidya Dahejiya regards as a prominent
Yes.
Yogini shrine? So, can it be said that Brahminical or Tantric Shaktism did have a fair share of impact on this particular shrine?
Okay, thanks, Amal. Amal is our student at GCAC. Amal, thank you for your question. I'm glad you have read with the India. Now, the influence of Tantra Yogini has to be answered in different way, and of the environment, I would like to answer in different way. We do have incorporation of Yogini cult in Jainism, but the evidence for which comes very late. I mean, I am not aware of any, at least a textual reference, and not of any archaeological reference of incorporation of Chaucer Yogini in the Jain tradition before 13th century. So the earliest record that I know is of 14th century Western India, and that is only for pratishthas and other rituals, right? And where Ashtamatrika are incorporated in those rituals. Now, it is I mean, it is difficult to say make a direct linkage between Yogini shrines at Gadarmal and this place, but why not? I mean, the influence of Shaktism in Jainism is there. So if in this landscape, but also in other parts of subcontinent as well, we have to see, like in Karnataka, you have cult of Padmavati, Jwala Malini, and the way they have been described is very much influenced by the Shakti Tantra or Shaiva Tantra, right? So that kind of influence, even if in direct manner, can be gleaned from this side.
Thank you very much, Anchit, for answering that
Thank you.
particular question. And I'm very glad that your students are asking great questions too.
Uh,
Yogesh Prabhu Desai is asking, in fact, he's first appreciating you. He's saying, very impressive lecture, Anchit. Thank you. The number of Yakshinis and the temple and its history are very interesting to study from the perspective of Shakti Sadhana and its need for that particular time and development accordingly. Mostly from the perspective of royal needs of supernatural assistance and support. In fact, it's a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Yogesh Bhai, for this compliment and for your comment. It is certainly true, but then I come to this kind of question or contemplation that the incorporation of Shakti, could this be simply for the royal needs? I mean, royal needs a patronage. I mean, that is something I have discussed for today thing. But could there be other reasons for this kind of incorporation? Could God, I'm working on a project in which a 12th century very prominent Jain epistemologist from Western India incorporated cult of a tantric goddess in the Zen tradition. Right. Now, if you think about these cults, I mean, not every time it can be for royal support. There could be other reasons for these kind of incorporation as well. Perhaps, Jains could not live independent of the overall religious atmosphere. I mean, we someone calls it a Shaiv age, as Alexis Sanderson would say, or the age of Sri Vidya, as Madhu Khanna would say. Jains cannot respond independently. Okay.
Yes, that was a very interesting way of interpreting. There are no further questions, it seems. Okay, there's one question by Akshay Kumar Ardande. He's asking, can you tell us about the unique architectural features and artifacts found within the temple?
Okay. Found within the temple. I wish I had a very proper answer to this. Unfortunately, in my field work, I myself could not get entry inside the temple to look it from my own eyes to analyze. So whatever information that I have on the interiors of the temple is largely coming from the earlier reports, Krishna Deva, Bhandarkar, Cunningham, and so on. We Yeah, entry is totally banned. Let's hope to get someday. But I mean, the placement of say Ashtamatrika, the Saptamatrika and Ganesh and Veerbhadra is something very interesting, right? Then the spaces that have been created to include more and more images. Right. So, say for example, on the mandap on the either side, they have created false windows where the images of say God, goddess, whosoever could be placed. But even on the outside of the sanctum walls, they have three images, one big and two smaller, three niches on all three sides. So nine images around the sanctum. So spaces that have been created to incorporate more and more images. The surviving images only of Chakreshwari over there.
Yes,
Thank
thank you
you,
very
Manjari
much.
ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anchit, for highlighting this particular temple, its architecture, its history, various layers associated with this temple. In fact, I remember last year when Dr. Shrikant Ganvir, the coordinator of Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair for Jain Archaeology, took us all students to for a study tour at this particular temple. It was like the evening time, and we saw the best ever sunset. So I believe that landscape has also had its own role to play in the making of this
That's
very temple.
amazing.
Yes. So now I request our research fellow, Prashant Goyal, to kindly present a formal vote of thanks for our speaker, Anchit Jain.
Thank you, Ocean. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair for Jain Archaeology, Department of Ancient Indian History, Culture and Archaeology, Deccan College Postgraduate and Research Institute, Pune, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to all of you for being part of today's event. A special and sincere thanks to Mr. Anchit Jain ji for delivering Professor H.D. Sankalia monthly lecture series on Jain art and archaeology. Your lecture on Guru, Goddess, and God at Gyaraspur Maladevi Jain Temple was deeply informative and thought provoking. We are truly grateful for your presence and for sharing your rich knowledge with us. I would also like to thank you, my fellow team, my members at the Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair for Jain Archaeology, for their constant support and coordination in organizing this event smoothly. I would also like to thank all the esteemed guests for their presence, especially Dr. Jaswant Modi sir, Dr. Naren Parson sir, Professor Neeru Mishra madam, Professor Sudeepa Rai Bandyopadhyay ma'am, Dr. Manjari Bhalerao ma'am, Dr. Lena Dhanani madam, Singh and Eva ma'am for joining us. And finally, warm thank you to all who attend today's lecture. Your presence and engagement made this session more meaningful. Thank you once again, and we look forward to meeting you at our future event. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting and for this very amazing platform. Thank you, Ocean. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I remember, sir,
Thank you, Anchit. Thank
after
you,
your
everyone.
visit to the Maladevi temple when you took your students, and I had a chat with you when I had said that